All right, now in addition to these individual level life themes, one of my goals was to look at themes that ran across all of the different narratives, right? So what were some things that were common to all of them or to most of them? This next section I'm going to talk about some of these universal life themes. While each of our lives has a unique theme, those called to ministry experience similar and distinct seasons related to their call. And so I put these together in what I call the 5 universal seasons of calling. The first is awaiting, the second is awareness, the third is actualizing, the fourth is anguishing, and the fifth is acceptance. Now let's take a look at each of these. The first season is what I call awaiting, or the pre-call circumstances. Most feel that childhood is important because it often set the stage for later events which are important to our call. Some of the sub-themes I heard in this season were things like a happy early environment. They had a good background, they had a good family, they were loved, they had good role modeling, those sorts of things. Another theme was rebellion. They didn't have a good family, or they rebelled away from their family's values, those sorts of things. And then another theme was early leadership opportunities. So most of these men had opportunities to do something. They were considered a leader early on in their lives. Other kids looked up to them. They were kind of the leader of the pack, or the leader of the gang, or the leader of the schoolyard, or whatever, whatever it was. And they didn't really see themselves as a pastor at that point. But on reflecting, they said, yes, I actually, I was a bit of a leader early on. I did these sorts of things and led the crowd, so to speak. Now, the second season is what I call awareness, recognition of the call through spiritual awakening or involvement. This second stage covers the years that we typically become aware of the fact that we have a call. And so the themes here were calling as an epiphany through supernatural signs, or calling as a byproduct of serving. Now, this is very interesting, all right? So let's pause just a little bit here, because I think this is important. Now, again, when we kind of look at some of the typical narratives, some of these, historic things from Scripture, for example, or some of the church history, the saints kind of literature, we often see that calling was sort of like this, the skies opened up and a voice came down from heaven and, I want you to go and do this, right? So we think of, people in Scripture, or maybe even some kind of classic narratives, right, where there was this really profound spiritual experience where it was just definitive and it was a marker in time, and that was it. So that was one narrative that I heard from people where they really sensed, at this moment God spoke to them and they knew that they had a call. But another theme that I heard was this idea that, they had a sense of calling, but it wasn't really like a specific moment. They served, they were involved in church, they were like a church rat. They were like always there, right? Every time the doors were open. And in time, they sensed that, boy, you know what? I think I am called to this. Now, that doesn't mean that they never had any supernatural activity or they didn't experience the presence of God. But they almost ashamedly said, yeah, I never really had like the moment, right? I had that moment when God spoke to me and called me, but nevertheless, they knew that they were called. Now, I think this is important because sometimes, we kind of, labor under this idea that, maybe we're even challenged to say, I never had like that moment where I felt the call, right? But we still, we're really drawn towards ministry. We're drawn towards the service that we're involved in. And so, it's not that uncommon. And I know that Daniel Brown talks about this as well, this idea of more of a byproduct, Lord, that we just serve, and then, that's it. Like, we know that we're called because of our effectiveness in ministry, because of all these kinds of things, affirmations and whatnot, right? So I just want you to be aware that some great leaders before you have kind of entered into ministry, have a strong sense of calling, but yet have not had that singular event. Now, I'll talk a little bit more about the interaction of the supernatural here in a moment. Now, the next season is what I call actualization. Realization of the call through experience, mentoring, and preparation for vocational service. In this stage, our lives are a series of events, experience, people, or preparation activities that support the fulfillment of our calling. Now, some of the themes that I heard in this stage were things like having a personal mentor or being mentored from afar, going to college to prepare for ministry, or going to college to discover a newfound passion for serving, success in ministry, and then supernatural or spiritual indicators. All right, so kind of going back to what I was just talking about before, because one did not have the seminal epiphany in their lives, that didn't necessarily mean that God didn't speak to them or there was no supernatural spiritual indicators. Sometimes it would be sort of somebody coming up to them and confirming, I believe God said this, or some sort of vision or an experience with God that confirmed their calling per se, right? So I don't want you to think that, there was any, it was just all a rational thing. God was involved in their lives throughout, and I think God needs to be involved in our lives throughout, right? Obviously. Let me talk about some of these other things. Having a personal mentor or mentor from afar, and this is important. And we talked about leadership development, and the way it happens is when we have a mentor, right? When we have somebody who speaks into our life, who kind of steers us one way or the other. And sometimes this happens, from a real personal experience with somebody we know, a pastor, a coach, a parent. But sometimes it happens, by people who are reputable, by notable Christian leaders, people like Pastor Jack and others, maybe have a great ministry, writing ministry, or they're sort of a national figure. So we're sort of mentored by people that we don't really know, but still they have a profound influence on our lives. Another interesting theme I found here was this idea of what happens at college. And this really helped me when I was teaching undergrads, because sometimes I saw these kids there and I was like, well, why is this guy at a Bible college? What are they even doing here? I just assumed that people would go to Bible college to prepare for ministry because they had a sense of call. Well, my experience, that wasn't true. There were some kids there that were just kind of, floating around and going through the motions, and some kids dropped out, unfortunately. But what I found was that that some of the people in my sample here actually were not sure about their call, and as they went through school, it was confirmed, right? So God used that process not as sort of, okay, I come in and I have a sense of call and now I'm prepared. It's sort of like, I got to figure this whole thing out. And maybe there's something going on there. I want to study Scripture. I want to grow. I want to be part of this movement. And so college can become part of that process that helps us prepare. Now, why is that important to you? Well, you guys are in college, right? So you might be going through this thing thinking, I'm not exactly sure what I'm called to or if I'm called, but I really feel, called to do this, right? I feel like God wants me to be part of this school. You're in good company, you know what I mean? It's okay for you to kind of explore and discover and to learn as you're going through school. So don't feel like, well, I never had the moment. I don't know exactly what I'm called to. It's okay. It's all right. You can discover God's going to use the people and the classes and the interaction and the fellow students and the experiences that you're having in school to direct you and to shape you and to refine that calling. So by the time you're done, maybe you'll be a little bit closer to knowing what it is that God would have you do with your life. Let's move ahead here. Now, this season here I think is particularly important. And this is what I call anguishing. Struggle to separate from previous roles and identities and dealing with pre-call stage issues. Some of the themes I heard here were things like personal conflict and release, and identity conflict and release. This next stage is characterized by two things: a personal conflict with a significant character in our story, like a mentor, a parent, a pastor, and a struggle to release a previous role or identity. Now, this was a big one, because all the other things you probably could have said, well, I experienced those, I could have figured those out. This one here to me was a bit groundbreaking, and I think perhaps one of the more interesting parts of my research. And oftentimes we think that when we have a call, it means what? Easy peasy, all the winds at our back, and everything's going to be great, and everybody's going to recognize and accept this, and we're just going to kind of move and groove with Jesus, right? Well, that may be true, but in my research, I found that these men, without exception, all experienced a sense of struggle, right? And they struggled with two different things. They struggled either with a person or they struggled with an identity that was kind of lingering from before, right? Remember we talked about this idea of identity development, who we are, who we think we are, what's the most important aspect of ourselves, of our personality. So, for example, this personal conflict, it might have been with a mother or a father or a pastor, right? So there was somebody in their lives who was preventing them from moving into the fullness of their calling. It was sort of an emotional bondage, if you will, that by which the person said, I can't really move into this because I'm still dealing with this person or whatever. And the second was this identity issue, right? Some people were businessmen, some people were musicians, some people were other things that kind of really were so strongly embedded in who they were, it was hard for them to move on from those things. So there was a bit of anguish here, right? It was a stage where they really had a hard time feeling their identity as a leader because they had this other identity, or because they had this person in their life that it was hard to sort of get past the emotional connection and the things that this person was, doing to them, so to speak, that didn't allow them to move into the fullness of their calling. So I think this is very important when we think about our own lives, right? Who are the people and what are the identity issues that we struggle with that hinder us from moving into the fullness of our calling? And then the last season I call acceptance ? And there are several themes here: satisfaction with the current role, or dissatisfaction with the current role. At this stage, we become okay with our call, yet still perhaps wonder if there is something more. Okay, so as I mentioned in this fourth stage, or fourth season, this idea of anguish, in the fifth stage, people were okay. They said, yeah, I'm okay, I'm cool, this is what God's called me to do, and this is what I want to do. Or they said, no, this is not cool, this is not what I want to do. And so you'd be surprised, actually a majority of the people that I interviewed fell into this second category of dissatisfaction. And I think this is kind of makes sense when you think about it, right? I think we're always changing, we're always growing, we're always looking for new challenges. What's important to us changes, our experience, kind of, moves us along, so to speak. And so perhaps this really is more of an idea of role or ministry assignment, rather than calling. But to me, they're all pretty integrated, right? Because if, for example, if, the door opens for you to pastor a really large church, right? Did God call you to do that? Yeah, God did call you to do that. But it is also a role too, and a role is something that we can kind of, move in and out of. So I don't know, kind of, hindsight, I've kind of wondered if this is really calling or role acceptance or fit. I don't know. The jury's still out a little bit on this one. But what I can say definitively is that historically, typically, we think of calling as sort of like this panacea, right? And when you look at the career literature, you see calling really as sort of like the ultimate subjective connection with our career, right? It's just such a good fit. It's part of who we are and everything's great, right? And it would almost be like the pinnacle experience. Yeah, you want to find your calling in life so that you can be satisfied and happy and really play to your strengths and all those kinds of things. Well, I guess what I discovered here is that getting to that place where you feel called and passion and all those kinds of things, it wasn't necessarily the definitive end mark where you said, yep, I found it, I got my calling, I'm in my role here, this is great. There was still always a bit of wrestling. And what I found was that wrestling typically had to do when people didn't deal with those other issues, the identity issues, right? So who am I really? So when we're grown up, especially if we're grown up outside of the church, we kind of have this identity that we bring with us even to the church. Now, of course, I know that Jesus sanctifies us, right? And we have a new identity in Christ. I remember when I got saved, I used to be a musician, so like Frank the rock star, and that was my identity. That's what I wanted to do. And I got saved, and it wasn't very long before I said, that identity doesn't fit me anymore. I am Frank, the born-again Christian. I've been called by Jesus, and I don't know what he's got for me, but it ain't that anymore, all right? So I had no problem, right? But, here I am, 30 some odd years later, I'm still a musician. I still love to play, Am I going to stay out late and do a gig and miss church the next day? I mean, right? All right, silly example, but, sometimes these things in our lives, they don't go away, right? So they're still part of who we are. And I think in my research, I found that a lot of successful pastors still had that kind of identity wrestling thing. And so they weren't sure if they wanted to pastor, if they wanted to go in the mission field, if they wanted to be, a minister of music, they wanted to go back into business, they wanted to start a nonprofit, right? So they still had ambitions and things that were part of who they were, part of their identity, that kind of, conflicted with their role or sense of call to this particular place. I don't know if that makes sense to you, but that's kind of what I found. So in a typical story, we have a nice, tidy, happy ending, right? Well, because I was exploring lived experiences, there was no happy ending yet. There was no ending. But it really sort of questions this idea, this sort of prototypical narrative that now we have a happy ending. While typical stories end with nice, happy endings, the reality of lived stories is that they are still incomplete and thus have rarely reached the happy ending. Many pastors express ambivalence about their current role and are still questioning if they're in the right place. And so to re-look at my story, my narrative stage approach here, you can see that there's the 5 stages here: awaiting, awareness, actualization, anguishing, acceptance. But then, because of these identity issues and whatnot, there was sort of this re-looping back to the anguishing stage. And so I found that the key to contentment versus dissatisfaction in our current role may be how identity and relational conflict issues were dealt with in stage 4. Dissatisfaction leads to persistent revisiting of previous stage issues, okay? So you might be in that place where you're like, I don't know, man, I can't really accept the call, I can't really move into this role. And you might want to look at those issues, and you might want to say, yeah, maybe there is an identity issue going on, something I'm holding on to, or a relationship, that I need to deal with that's kind of preventing me from moving into this. So let's come down the home stretch here. And what can we conclude about this whole matter? Well, the conventional wisdom often is that calling is a positive, satisfying, and life-congruent experience. However, a calling is often experienced as a source of ongoing challenge. A challenge to overcome, to persist in the face of obstacles, to breach the personal or social conventions that one has come to know, to accept an identity that challenges and reconfigures previous self-conceptions, and to find contentment in one's role. And so, a more sober definition of calling, in light of the evidence uncovered, would suggest this: that a calling is an ongoing process by which one comes to terms with and overcomes both interpersonal conflicts with significant others and intrapersonal conflicts with the self over competing identities, the result of which is the removal of barriers which would otherwise prevent them from finding personal sense of destiny and purpose in life. All right, so I know this isn't the most elegant definition you've probably ever heard, but because a calling is a complex thing, it is difficult for me to say a calling is, an experience where you know that you are, called to do this, where you're supposed to do something like that. My research here really uncovered the fact that, all these different elements, right? The context, the process, the antecedents, i.e. the things that came before, the things that came after, right? All these things kind of complicated, right? So really when we think about what a calling is in terms of our own identity and leadership development, we need to think a little more complexly. It's not quite as simple as, Jesus asked me to do this. Yeah, Jesus asks us to do things all the time. He's asked me to do things. But when I think about my calling and how it's embedded in my identity, there's some subtlety, there's some nuance, there's some complexity to it, right? Obedience to Jesus always, yes, in the context of what else is going on in our lives. So as you think about this topic here, I want you to reflect on some of these questions. As you review the 5 seasons of calling development, reflect on your own life and experience and ask, what experiences early in your life reflect God's calling? What has God used to awaken you to your calling, either natural or supernatural means? Who has God used to shape and influence your calling? What personal relationships have or currently do present a challenge in realizing your calling? And what former identities have currently present a challenge to you realizing your calling? Well, that is about it. I know that this is sort of a long topic, and that's why I spread it out a little bit. But hopefully this was helpful to you. And again, as leaders, people that want to be shakers and movers in the kingdom, we need to kind of really think about our calling. What is it? How does it, shape me? How does it shape my identity? How is it part of the experience that God has brought me through in my life, right? So complexify your life just a little bit and think about your calling in this kind of larger context, not as just a moment per se, but really as part of the fabric, the story of your life. And as you stop and think about your life and all these different seasons and chapters, perhaps you can come to more clarity on what God has called you to do. And why is that important? Well, because ultimately, at the end of the day, when we lay our heads on the pillow, or when we show up to the office, wherever that is, we want to say, yeah, this is something I believe I've been called to, and here's why. Here's who God has made me to be. Here's my passions. Here's my gifts. Here's my story, if you will. My story has shaped who I am. And at the end of the day, we can look back and say, yeah, I lived a life that was congruent with my story, that was on a path, that was on a trajectory that the Lord led me down, right? So I met him along the way. I had experiences along the way. There was confirmation through signs and wonders as part of this complexity, this tapestry that is the story of my life, right? So I hope this helps. God bless you as you move on, as you explore your story and your calling and serve Jesus. God bless you.